Welcome, my friends. We are on DAZN. I am Kyle Brandt. This is KSI versus Logan Paul 2.
It's a history in the making day today.
This is American history in the making right now.
It's absolute madness. I mean, the build-up, the numbers. These guys are amazing self-promoters.
What do you want to see from this fight?
I want to see these guys go at it. I want to see a brawl.
Listen, this thing has been brewing for over a year since the first fight.
This is going down in history as one of the greatest events of all time. People will talk about this decades from now.
6 rounds, 3 minutes each, and 10-ounce gloves.
When you get hit with the 10-ounce glove with no headgear, it's like getting hit with a rock.
Can you give me your best insult for Logan Paul?
I don't really have an insult for him, but I don't really get why he's here.
He shouldn't even be here.
Apart from to save his career.
Don't you think this sort of feels like a big night for the internet? Charlie bit me is now Logan hit me.
Someone could get humiliated. Someone's career could be in jeopardy.
We both put in too much work for this not to be the best show of 2019.
DAZN, go get the app. Everybody cue Michael Buffer because it is fight time in Los Angeles.
Morning, everyone.
Morning.
Hello. Always a tough slot following Jeff. We're nervous and we saw we were after Jeff. I thought they did a great job and yeah, really interesting to hear what Bleacher Report's up to. Sorry for everyone, a bit of a switchover, I think, in the room, so just feel free to join us when you're ready. So, look, I want everyone to join me in welcoming Joe Markowski. He's the Executive Vice President of DAZN for North America. Joe is responsible for both the DAZN US and Canadian markets. He previously led the DAZN Japan business from 2016 to 2018, which included the launch of the business with the premier Japanese domestic rights, soccer rights, that is, J-League. And prior to launch of DAZN, he worked for the previous holding company of DAZN, Perform, for 8 years. With a great reputation that Joe had, he came over to the US and has set about what has been a pretty formidable task about building a business initially focused around boxing, some big deals around the likes of Canelo and Golovkin, Joshua. You guys might have seen announced the MLB rights deal that they added last year. 3-year deal, 300 million, I think, over the term. So we're going to kind of go into a bit around the boxing business, the challenges and the exciting things that have happened in that business over the last few years. I think, even if you're not a boxing fan, it's hard to have not seen there's been some pretty extraordinary matchups over the last 3 or 4 years. And then really, what has a diversification of the rights portfolio done? And then we're going to come on to the impact of celebrity YouTube fights onto the business. I don't think any of us 3 or 4 years ago saw this coming, although Jeff actually might argue that he did see it coming. But yeah, no, it's definitely been an interesting time. So Joe, we last talked about boxing back at Leaders, I think in May last year. Do you want to give us a bit of an update on what's been going on in the business? Yeah,
It's been an interesting time for the sport of boxing. We are one of several big players making big investments in the sport. It's, I think, injected a lot of interest, a lot of broadcast revenue into the sport. There's lots of competition around boxing as one playing field in a much bigger sort of battle for the streaming sport wars, if you want to call it that. I think that's good for the sport of boxing. This weekend, obviously a huge heavyweight clash, ESPN and Fox sort of co-pay-per-view with Wilder and Fury. That's great for the sport. It's been a while since there's been a heavyweight clash as big as that. We obviously represent or work very closely with Anthony Joshua, so our involvement in that going forward will be significant, and we'll watch that with interest. But it's a healthy time for the sport across multiple weight divisions.
For the Wilder fight, for example, what will you guys do on the DAZN platform? Are you going to cover it in any way?
I mean, we're carrying the rights in 5 markets internationally, not in the US, unfortunately for me, or in Canada, actually. But yeah, we'll carry promotional content. We're producing lots of content in other markets we're in, and we'll carry that on the US platform.
I mean, it's easy to, here in the United States, think about what DAZN is doing, here, but, clearly around the world, DAZN, whether it's Champions League rights in Germany, J-League, as we discussed in Japan, DAZN has not been afraid of investing in premium rights. How do you work with the rest of the DAZN business when it comes to boxing, when clearly it is your kind of nuts and bolts here, or has been?
Yeah, I think for an American audience, it's easy to forget that we are a multi-sport broadcaster in all of the markets we're in, including the US. I think the misconception of our US business, our business more generally, is that we are the boxing guys. The US is an edge case in our market portfolio. We've come in with a very specific initial niche investment in a sport that we saw huge opportunity in, and we're happy with how we've gone. But globally, multi-sport proposition with premium rights, and in most of the markets that are 3 or 4 years in, we're now number 1 and number 2 in terms of sports broadcaster, full stop in that market. Japan and Germany being the most mature markets we're in. There's lots of collaboration across the business, content production, marketing efficiency, as you'd expect. Bruno was on stage yesterday, my colleague from Brazil. So we're in touch regularly. It's it's a 15-year-old business before DAZN, and lots of us go back a long way. So there's lots of sort of soft relationships as well as more formal collaboration across the business.
Because of the different set of rights mixes in each market, and actually I don't know how much you guys are aware, but some quite different distribution strategies. Do you want to kind of explain to the room a bit about, in other markets, how they've tackled reach and potentially churn, and what you've learned from that in the US, and how you, what you're thinking about, like what's success for you in terms of how a customer behaves when it comes on the platform?
The key thing is watching multiple genres of content. I think that's probably consistent with most digital or OTT businesses. The data is very clear that if you get a consumer watching more than one type of content, so in Japan, if they're watching the soccer and the baseball, they are significantly less likely to churn, even if those seasons run in parallel, if that makes sense. As soon as you have someone watching or having multiple reasons to watch regularly, the risk of churn is dramatically reduced. So cross promotion, introduction of content to different segments of consumers is really important, and we're increasingly adept at serving targeted content to, let's say you have a user who's only watching soccer in Japan, making sure they're being pushed far more than with baseball content than someone who's already watching baseball and soccer, if that makes sense. So targeting personally how we interact with our consumers to increase the chances of them sticking around and rolling on month to month.
So when we look at the US with the addition of baseball rights, so for those of you who aren't aware of what the product is, it's a kind of red zone type live looking, whip round the grounds product, which you guys launched in June? March.
Season start last year, yeah.
Do you want to explain to the room a little bit about like how have you managed to, does a boxing fan cross over to baseball? Did they do it more or less? Did you bring in people that you weren't expecting to bring in?
Yeah, I think initially, the primary motivation for us doing that deal is you're in business with a top 4 domestic sports league in the US. Less than a year into our entry, that was an opportunity you couldn't really pass on. It was absolutely intended initially to bring in a new audience, and it has done that. It's a distinct audience. Boxing and baseball, there is crossover, notably in the Mexican-American community, but it's also absolutely worked as a retention sort of vehicle for us. Boxing is a spiky business. You have weeks, sometimes months, without a major event happening. It's the nature of the sport, and so sort of to de-risk our schedule, having a daily 6-7 hour show running for a decent part of the year is a fantastic addition to our sort of engagement portfolio for consumers. So it's definitely worked as background noise to some baseball fans who are boxing fans, who've come in, but it's also attracted a significant new audience who are watching DAZN primarily for that content.
Do you see the boxing group and the baseball group, albeit with this Hispanic probably dominating the crossover piece, do you see them behaving differently from a subscription perspective? So you've got your annual pass, which, if you, versus what you're $20 a month, right, for monthly, and then
$100 for the year.
And $100 for the year. So clearly a big incentive to say, if you're going to watch, more than 5 months worth of content with us, it's worth you taking the full year. How's that performed for you?
The biggest segment difference I can see is there's the hardcore boxing fans who want to watch every single fight, and there's a distinct base there for boxing and for Bellator or MMA offering who have the annual. They consume everything all the time. Very low risk of churn, obviously, with the annual pass. rolling year to year.
And we're still in the first year of that, so we've not seen have many people been through a full year yet?
Very few.
Yeah.
It was about a year ago we launched it, just over a year ago we launched it. The second group, distinct group, is the more casual boxing fan who are at higher risk of churn. People like yourself, if you this morning, who come in for an Anthony Joshua fight as a British expat in New York, and then churn immediately afterwards. So thanks for that, Hannah.
I just like to say that I have a housemate who's in the room who was not a boxing fan, and I actually really enjoyed much as there's been lots of controversy, and we should touch on it about the fight against Saudi Arabia. But for those of us who don't like to stay up too late, I quite enjoyed a mid-afternoon fight.
It's actually I was very worried.
To be very nice.
I was really worried about the impact of that fight being on a sort of abnormal time zone for an American audience. Obviously, that was a concern. It actually didn't really affect the audience numbers in terms of our projections if it had been in a US time zone versus what we actually ended up delivering, and it worked brilliantly for our international markets, notably Germany. So, despite all the controversy, can't stand here and say that I liked the fact it went to Saudi Arabia. It ultimately wasn't our decision; it's a decision of the promoter. It worked out business-wise okay for us in the end. Yeah. So
was it just kind of in line with what you were expecting, or did you actually, those of us that aren't night owls actually got a little peek in the Upper West Side subscriber base?
It was a fantastic event. I think the narrative around a fight like that sort of sells itself. It's similar to this weekend with Fury and Wilder. People have to watch that, and that's true of casual fans as well as hardcore fans. So very rarely, and it's hard to manufacture a narrative like that, sort of like a last chance for AJ. Can Ruiz pull it off again? Is he a one-hit wonder? That narrative and the fact it was in Saudi Arabia, the controversy around that, all of that played into a great event for us.
It's actually, and we talked about this a little bit last night. What was the mood in the room? Clearly, fast forward, we all now know that Ruiz became some Mexican superhero, and it worked brilliantly, especially here in the US with the fan base that Ruiz will have brought in. But what was the mood 5 minutes after the fight when Joshua? I was at the fight. It was a huge shock, right? And he got well beaten. It wasn't just a.
Yeah, it was. I was shell shocked. I was sat with John Skipper and Simon Denyer and various guests of theirs, and it was all a bit weird, to be honest. I was so shocked by what happened. Initially, I thought it was a disaster for our business. The reality is it delivered the biggest heavyweight fight, the biggest rematch in boxing of numerous years at the end of 19. So it gave us a fantastic end to the year as part of what we believe was the strongest boxing schedule ever put together. That's how we marketed it. So that worked out well, but in the immediate aftermath, it was, we were shocked and not happy about it.
Yeah, I guess it's the beauty of the rematch clauses, right?
Exactly, and as a champion, you're given that opportunity to take the rematch immediately. And hats off to AJ for backing himself to do that.
Yeah. Before we move on, we are going to move on from Anthony Joshua, begrudgingly, but. Let's just talk a little bit about Saudi Arabia. We hadn't planned to talk about that, but I think it would be...
Nice little curveball there.
Well, I know, but I just think that it's something that's come up a lot. Clearly it came up yesterday on another panel about Syria taking games to Saudi Arabia. Spoke to lots of ex-colleagues and, plenty of people with, very understandable personal reasons about why they do or don't want to travel or engage with the region. How did you guys? You must have been lots of head scratching about that at DAZN and thinking about what you might do. Yeah,
I think it's fair to say, and Skipper's on record saying this, if it had been a DAZN decision, we wouldn't have done it. And despite the money involved for the fighters, notably, and the promoters, it wasn't something we would have sanctioned if we had full authority to do that, for the reasons that I'm sure everyone is familiar with. We've seen what the rest of the world has seen. What I can say is, judge it by an experience. Personally, the people we interact with in the government and the organisation there were fantastic hosts. It is clear that government is genuinely trying to make efforts to modernise and to grow its international reputation. So we'll see what happens with that. But clearly, we won't be pushing hard for lots of our events to go there. I think it's inevitable that more and more sport will go to that region because of the numbers being invested. I think it's the responsibility of rights holders and broadcasters to sort of collaborate on that and express the opinions that everyone in the room has and come to an agreement.
It's interesting because I think Josh has been pretty vocal. His next fight is going to be in London. Spurs, I think, is.
That's where it's looking like it's heading in June.
Yeah. So, aside from the kind of traditional boxing champions we've seen, and clearly we haven't touched on Canelo and Golovkin, but they've also done some big business for you, has been the rise of these kind of celebrity YouTuber fights, and KSI versus Logan Paul, 1 and 2 this year. I mean, I was looking at some stats that you shared with me, and much as there's been some huge sports events covered by DAZN around the world, last year, including Champions League finals and the big boxing fights that we've just been talking about, to name but a few. But number 5 came in was the KSI Logan Paul rematch of the DAZN's overall most streamed events in 2019, which is pretty phenomenal, right?
Yeah, it was a phenomenal event. I'm really proud we took it on. It became, I think, unarguably the biggest sort of internet moment of the back end of last year. The social numbers we saw are just phenomenal. And the beauty of it, of course, is that it's a completely new fan base for us. The new subscribers we brought in, 96% of those we'd never interacted with before. They're an entirely new audience. It also engaged, interestingly, our sort of real boxing audience. So despite all the chatter beforehand that this is a disgrace to the sport, it's making a mockery of a great sport, blah, blah, blah.
It was a good fight.
It was a good fight, and half of our existing base watched it. So in the US, it also worked for us brilliantly internationally. In Canada, it did a huge number of free trialists. In Germany, it engaged the audience, including everywhere but Japan, really. It popped for us. So it was a great event. It was a very efficient event. It's relative to a real boxing fight. It's money well spent.
Are you able to share a bit, like the commercials, I'm assuming, look wildly different to the...
They do, and they're not wildly different. The numbers were healthier, if that's a good way of putting it. And the audience numbers it did, the social audience it did, 25 million people watched the countdown show we produced. You saw some of that in the clip beforehand that went out on 6 YouTube channels, including their own. We've built a relationship from a data perspective with hundreds of thousands in the US, millions globally of their audiences. So if we want to run it back and dip our toes in that sort of water again, we have a ready-made marketable base of consumers to go and speak to, so it will become even more efficient next time. And I think personally it's a huge opportunity from a new sporting genre. It's a vehicle to engage young audiences who perhaps are more distracted with other entertainment than we were as kids. And that provides huge opportunity for the sports industry in general.
I mean, for those of you who aren't aware, YouTube subscribers, so outside of what they do on Instagram or wherever else, like between KSI and Logan Paul, they're pushing on for 100 million YouTube subscribers between the two of them, so pretty huge numbers. But kind of touching on what Jeff and the Turner guys were talking about earlier, so they watched a load of video on social. You clearly did a decent number on platform. Love it if you'd share with me what that number is, but you might not.
I won't.
But how are you extracting value from that YouTube audience or that social audience and the Instagram audience that, I know did phenomenally well for you? And I get around retargeting and accessing, but are they actually switching over from social into an environment where you're extracting value from them?
I think the unique ability of these top YouTube influencers, content creators, call them what you want, is their ability to pick up a free-to-air audience on YouTube and move it into a transactional environment. They do that with e-commerce, with their merchandise sales. They do it with events like this.
So you saw that people came in
huge,
and then
huge.
they...
I mean, piracy is a consideration. We'll get onto that, absolutely. But we saw a huge number of new subscribers transacting to become DAZN subscribers. Now, we're not going to see loads of those guys become annual subscribers and watch multiple events until we have a series of content, a tournament or something similar that will engage this base. So we're looking at that right now. But as an initial test to see if we could actually pick up that free-to-air audience on YouTube and move it behind our paywall, that was the purpose of the 1 or 2 fights we've done so far. It worked, and so we're looking to invest more and looking to invest over a longer period of time in some sort of series or tournaments.
Yeah, and I think that there are other broadcasters around the world. I think they had a similar kind of performance with that out of the UK as well, and we're also equally pleased. And there was plenty of head scratching about whether...
I won't say the number that I've heard whispered, but Sky in the UK, given KSI being British Sky, was a huge number at 5 in the morning. It was in LA at 9 p.m.
It was phenomenal.
It's an amazing international reach these guys have, and I say a unique ability to move free-to-air audiences behind a paywall. It's just truly remarkable.
So before we go on to Piracy, which I think for this audience, but for the audience around the YouTube fights, couldn't be more pertinent. what? And we're now 7 weeks, 8 weeks after the rematch. A bit more.
It was November.
November. So it'd be 13, 14 weeks, whatever it is. How have you? I'm assuming you've seen a huge amount of churn off that base. Have any of them stayed with you, or?
We ran a fight with Logan Paul's brother Jake in Miami in Super Bowl week. That wasn't
quite as good.
It wasn't quite as good in terms of technical performance from his opponent, no. But to be fair to Jake, he looked the real deal, relatively. Look, we re-engage that base. Actually, interestingly, Jake and his brother Logan have a different audience. Jake's audience skews younger. He's younger, it makes sense. He's also like a former Disney star, so he has that sort of following with him. So look, that was another sort of test. It was a smaller event. It didn't have the same hype as the KSI Logan Paul fight. But again, it's another sort of test for us, another data point to say, yeah, this works. And it does work. It generates new audiences. We mix them on both occasions with real boxing. So, yeah, the sort of slightly unenvious task of convincing a world champion to fight on the undercard of 2 YouTubers making their professional debut. But in both instances, that has worked for us. As
Look,
I said,
these guys, they're not daft, right? And they know that this is raising their profile. And
the data point I like to reference is Billy Joe Saunders, who's rumoured to be a Canelo opponent in the near future, fought on the KSI Logan Paul undercard. He's a world champion, British guy. His US search, like Google trend data, in the week of the fight grew 1,300% relative to the sort of his previous fight week. So the interest that these guys are generating from a completely new audience is valuable to them. A lot of them are now like pushing Eddie, the promoter, to help them become a YouTube sensation, which is obviously a pretty tough ask for a low-level boxer or even a world champion boxer in some instances. So it's whetted their appetite, and as I say, it's whetted our appetite to do more. I genuinely think, and I know not everyone likes it, and for a traditional sports fan, it may be a slightly hard pill to swallow, but sport needs to embrace this sort of stuff because the generation coming up now have got so much entertainment opportunity being pushed at them. They're distracted, and they're not. I grew up watching every sport under the sun because there wasn't the internet, there wasn't a lot of YouTube clips to go and watch. These guys have more options now, and we need to stitch our content into the formats that they enjoy to engage them.
And a slightly boring business question, but if you're attracting, a normal fight fan or a baseball fan, I'm similar in our business. There's a lot of thought around what's my subscriber acquisition cost, what channel am I using, and then you're weighing that up against churn and lifetime value, etc., and figuring out if your rights are worth it. What about with the YouTubers? Is because the reach is so big, does SAC fall so much so you don't actually mind high churn?
Need so much money.
Yeah, so you don't mind churn so much.
The deal we did with them was inclusive of a load of marketing obligations across their channels. It's a pipeline to this audience. The numbers they do.
The point is you can make money off one fight. Even if they do churn, it's actually...
Two of our top 3 ever YouTube videos that we've put out happened that week. The face-off and the weigh-in. I think them hugging in the ring afterwards is our most engaged Instagram post of all time. So the engagement you get even on our own channels when they're involved, let alone on their channels themselves, you're buying 3 months of time of them training, and all they're talking about, rather than driving fast cars and doing stupid stunts as they usually do, is boxing training. And by the way, it's on DAZN on this day. So you're buying call to action messaging on one of the most engaged marketing channels in the world for 3 months for not a lot of money.
Which actually is a beauty around the pay-per-view model, is if you can get all of the other news outlets talking about how fantastic your event is, they're marketing it for you. But my last question on the business model is, well, for those fights, why don't you go back to a more high-price pay-per-view where you say, well, actually, they might have paid $35 rather than $20 because they are literally going to come in and watch this one fight?
I think we're always testing that sort of question. I think with the YouTube stuff specifically, that the first fight, which was a YouTube pay-per-view in 2018, was $9.99, an equivalent number globally. Moving it to 35 would have been quite a bit lift, and I think at that point you massively open up the piracy risk. This is a young audience who don't have huge disposable income. They're probably nicking their parents' credit cards to go and buy his own subscription. So we were cognizant of that, and obviously we've got limited data points, but we're always testing around that.
We're going to just talk about piracy for a couple of minutes, and then we're going to open out to the room because I'd love to hear your questions for Joe. So feel free to get your questions into the system, and then in a couple of minutes we'll come on to those. Give ourselves 10 minutes or so for them. So piracy, you know, I'm a big believer that in order to tackle piracy, you've got to do it, you know, really across kind of 3 or 4 verticals, from the legislature, you know, there were lots more intelligent conversations on this yesterday, but from the legislation, from the technical piece, the policing, but then also you made an interesting point around pricing. You've got to make it a price and a quality of service that people go, I'm prepared to pay that for an uninterrupted service. So tell me about the impact on you and then what you've been doing to tackle it.
Well, I particularly enjoyed our technical conversation over dinner last night, 2 highly non-technical people talking about the technical elements of anti-piracy measures. No, jokes aside, I think piracy is a far bigger problem than the industry is currently giving credit for. It's a significant problem in this market, into the hundreds of billions of dollars of lost revenue. I don't think we quite, as an industry, understand the scale of it or have a view on the scale of it yet. I also don't think the industry currently is providing an adequate suite of tools to, be they technical, be they government lobbying, be they tech platform lobbying and support, to properly combat it. And I think as a business like ours, especially our business in the US, an event-based business with a growing brand awareness and a schedule that pops and then softens, I think we're one of the most exposed broadcasters to piracy in the world. I've been interestingly following the comments of the BN CEO, who's been probably the most aggressive sort of industry spokesperson on this, and I completely agree with him. It's a huge problem that is affecting everyone's business in this room, I imagine. And I think we as an industry need to really step up how we're doing it. And I think you're going to have to play dirty at some points. Why should you sit back and ignore crack streams, broadcasting your content and not, you know, push for more hostile reaction to that? Do we as an industry, you know, play them at their own game and hack them offline? I don't know. There's legal considerations to that as well. But I think there needs to be, to your point, a far bigger, more open, more transparent conversation that sees government level lobbying, far more support from tech platforms than we're probably getting currently, and a joined up group of broadcasters primarily, probably, and rights holders who recognise the risks of their businesses going forward, joining up and joining forces to push back on that.
In terms of what you see from DAZN markets around the world, is the US facing a very different threat to, you know, what's going on in Japan or Germany, for example? Yeah,
I think so, because in Japan and Germany, you're predominantly a soccer-led or baseball-led proposition. In Japan, you've got a league and you've got hundreds of games that people want to watch as a fan. You're probably more willing, if you're coming in for a one-off event, to take the risk on a pirate stream. I would assume the data I see suggests that. Than if you're an NFL fan in Canada, or if you're a Bundesliga fan, Champions League fan in Germany, you're probably less willing to take the risk week in, week out versus on a single event. So, as I say, the US business, I think, is most exposed to it. As a result, you'll see us start stepping up our activity in this space.
And I'm assuming you still, much as I'm sure there's lots of improvements you made, seeing lots of data around what you think your impact, your piracy was, or the amount of streams you're seeing. Was there a big difference between the KSI Logan fights versus?
Well, the volume of streams.
I
think we're doing the best we can do with the tools and resources available. So we have a war room on a big fight night that includes our social media team. It also includes our anti-piracy guys, and they are literally scanning the internet with digital fingerprinting tools as well as human manual stuff, identifying streams and cutting them down within minutes. The volume of those streams we identified for KSI Logan Paul was huge. I mean, at one point there was a guy on Instagram streaming the fight through the reflection of his sunglasses, and 11,000 people were watching that.
Wow.
So, you know, that's a relatively niche way of doing it. I actually quite respected it.
Must be some really snazzy
nice pair of sunglasses as well. They're polarized.
I don't have anything like that.
And that's sort of you're battling with some pretty innovative stuff, and we've just got to work out as an industry of how we get one step ahead. And I think you probably need to mix playing dirty with playing smart to a certain extent. And I think within the bounds of legality, we're gonna do that.
There was a comment yesterday which was, you know, the role actually that the ambassadors might have, so the Logan Pauls of the world and KSIs, who have all delighted in being kind of, you know, anti-establishment in terms of how they built their businesses, and now suddenly
that
turns out they're going to need to.
They're incentivized by subscriber numbers, right? So suddenly it's saying to Logan Paul, well, you've got to tell your audience not to Piracy. And he's like, I don't want to do that, bro. And I'm like, well, you're going to lose money if you don't. So it's an interesting sort of mindset shift for them.
Really interesting.